It's no grand secret that video game adaptations are generally not very good, yet somehow in the last couple years we've had both Arcane and Cyberpunk Edgerunners come out back to back, breaking what seemed to be a never-ending trend. But how did they do that? That's what we're discussing today, and by the end of this video, you're gonna know the 3 reasons that set Arcane and Edgerunners apart from the rest. Because the answer isn't as simple as, well, they're well written, they're good for any reason a show is good. Because if that was the case, video game adaptations would be at least decent far more often than they are. And there are good video game movies and shows out there. The Witcher is a solid example of that. Most people seem to like it, and even that's had some noticeably mixed reactions from fans of the franchise. But it can't be understated how much of a critical success Arcane and Edgerunners are across the board with such an overwhelmingly positive reception. Something about them is special, and I want to break down why that is because there are a few distinct reasons. And it really comes down to this: they're prequels. Now, I'm using the term prequel very loosely here, but both stories take place roughly before the events in the game's world that players would be most familiar with. This matters for a few important reasons. The first being that this avoids the issue of adaptation altogether. Retelling a story in a video game is inherently hard to do because a game is very freeform in its structure. Hell, League of Legends is so freeform, its game has nothing to do with the story, and it's all in a bunch of cinematics, comics, and exposition dumps on their website. The most you get in the game are voice lines from characters. And Cyberpunk 2077 is an RPG where you can choose how your story starts. These just don't work for anything like a movie or any kind of episodic structure without making deliberate choices that change the story in drastic ways. Things like this have an act structure that places limits on a story, but story-based games have no imposed structure beyond the different narrative beats, and pacing is mostly determined by the player. If a game allows a player to make meaningful choices, then not only does the story structure become ever-changing, so does its narrative beats. If you try to adapt an exact story, you're left with a lot of decisions to make, choosing what aspects of the game to compromise on so you can fit it into a new medium. This is why making them both prequel stories is so brilliant. In the case of Arcane, it works to show off character backstories because it's vague, with no imposed narrative limits beyond basic story beats. In the case of Edgerunners, you're just writing a new story in that world without contradicting the story of the game. Because if you just try to copy the game but in a new medium, more often than not you end up with an inferior product when you could just play the game. This brings us to the second benefit of a prequel. Arcane and Edgerunners are canon. Kind of. You see, video game movies and shows generally fall into 2 camps, ones that try to adapt the story into a new medium, and ones that tell a story that is practically unrecognizable aside from names and aesthetics. Kinda like the difference between Resident Evil and Resident Evil. And both of these are kind of lacking for the same reason, aside from being bad: they don't matter. Sticking with Resident Evil for a moment, the 2021 movie tries to squish the first and second games together. Meanwhile, the Paul Anderson films just basically do their own thing with entirely new characters and stories that can't exist within the lore of the games. And if you like them, that's totally fine, but what are they aside from fan fiction? Now don't get me wrong, this isn't me saying that everything needs to be a cinematic universe. Self-contained storytelling is perfectly acceptable, better in a lot of cases. But one of the coolest things about League of Legends and Cyberpunk is their worlds, and instead of rehashing a plot or just doing their own thing entirely, Arcane and Edgerunners go out of their way to meaningfully expand on those worlds, showing us stories that can only be told in them. Going back to my first point, even if you adapt the main points of a story well, you will have to make compromises to the story, and there will always be fans of the franchise that just aren't satisfied with that. Why, in that view, should anyone waste their time with an inferior experience of the story? At the end of the day, these stories want to please as many people as possible, both prior fans of the franchise and newcomers. But if all you do is adapt an already written story, then there will always be a vocal group of fans that hate it. By writing a prequel story, this obstacle doesn't even matter. As long as the story itself is executed well, there's the possibility of meaningfully working off of canon material without trampling on it and making a lesser experience. Instead, it's just a story that takes place in this world, adding to it instead of taking away from it. Now, to be fair, Arcane does change some lore and character details from the main content as we know it. Riot Games seems to be using Arcane as some kind of retcon. It's hard to tell what their plans are, to be honest. It wouldn't be the first time they retconned their lore. I'm just trying to say that not all of my points necessarily apply to Arcane because of this, but the broader ideas do. Anyway, looking at the larger picture, I cannot tell you how gratifying some of the stuff in Arcane was. Just seeing how all of these characters became who we know them as is so satisfying. Taking these blocks of text and in-game voice lines and turning it into an actual story, even if stuff is retconned. The attention to detail is really something else too, like taking the blue smoke tattoos that Jinx has, which were initially just a neat design choice, and making it a subtle point of characterization. Connecting it to the flare Vi gave her and implying that Jinx was always holding on to hope that Vi might come back. Stuff like that is why a prequel works so well. You can take these details that are purely superficial and expand upon them to make them actually meaningful. Arcane has tons of little details like this. And it's not alone. Edgerunners does a lot of neat stuff like that too. Night City is just such an interesting example of dystopian fiction, so being able to explore aspects of that world that aren't necessarily covered by the game is a unique opportunity. I think my favorite example of this is in the first episode when David's mom dies. It's a very classic trope, the MC's dead parent. But this show handles it incredibly well because she doesn't just die. She dies because of the excessive criminal violence in Night City purely as a bystander. She dies because she was overworked from trying to make ends meet, another facet of Night City. She dies because of her terrible insurance policy because she couldn't afford better. It's a death that highlights so many things wrong with the world of the game in such a chillingly casual way. And yeah, this is just the deep story details. On another level, it also just provides the opportunity to have fun with it. In the case of Arcane, I love the vague references to the Rune Wars. I love seeing Ryze be crazy powerful. I mean, we don't know if that was Ryze, but I hope so. I love seeing Jace and Vi get full cinematic fight scenes. In the case of Edgerunners, it's just really cool seeing Night City with such a beautiful style. The art and lighting of the anime is beautiful. And again, the fights. The crazy cybernetics is a huge aesthetic draw of the world, so seeing them all in action, especially with how they portray the Sandevistan, is so cool. Or how in the game there's a drink called the David Martinez, showing how the MC of Edgerunners did in fact become a legend by the end of the show. And not to mention Atom Smasher just showing up and being awesome, like that was so cool. So yeah, I could do a whole video on all the neat things these stories do with their world and characters in relation to their source material. But in these ways, they are also just such a treat for fans of these franchises. This is why making them prequels is important to their success. They can tell a story that won't step on the source material and have to worry about adaptation while still having elements that will make fans happy. Now you might be thinking, with all this talk of prequels, well, why not a sequel, or a story that takes place after the source material? After all, that has the same benefit of avoiding adaptation. One, showing how things came to be is usually more gratifying, but that's my opinion. The real reason is business. You don't want to make a Cyberpunk show and suddenly CD Projekt Red is coming out with a sequel game, and now those game devs have to take this show into account so they don't break canon. It makes things messy. A prequel has all these benefits without canon getting messy quite as easily. The prequel solution is basically just the best. You get to expand on the world and characters in ways that couldn't be done through a straight up adaptation, and you get a genuinely new product instead of just rehashing things. I mean, look at the reception to Arcane and Cyberpunk. People love their atmosphere, the character writing, the world building. If they just adapted pre-existing stories, all you'd really see people talking about is how well they adapted particular scenes. But this way, you can get shows that are genuinely good on their own merits. Recently, a trailer came out for a live-action adaptation of The Last of Us. It is one of my favorite games of all time. I still get chills from that final cutscene, and it's a story that I'm always going to remember. And I genuinely hope the show is good. I want good things for a franchise I like. But no matter how good it is, it will always be nothing more than an adaptation. There will always be a version of the story that my brain automatically considers the real story. I guess I'm making this video because I hope this prequel thing becomes a trend. I want to see these studios stop redoing the stories that have already been done. Instead of retelling a story that was built to be a video game, I hope they branch out and make stories that are actually designed to be a movie or show. Because as well tied to their franchises as Arcane and Edgerunners are, they can easily stand on their own. That's how you end up with something genuinely special.